Thanks for having me here. Hopefully I'll be able to give some of those of you who don't have as much experience with AI a bit of a foundation, and those of you who have an advanced understanding, maybe a few little bits to think about. So that's sort of the objective here today. We're going to do a quick introduction of DeepSense, going to talk a little bit about AI, then get into the risks and ethics around truth and knowledge, bias data, organizational impacts, and then hopefully some takeaways that you can bring home. So DeepSense itself, we're out of the Faculty of Computer Science. Our mandate is to help transfer the expertise of faculty and the talent of student bodies to the rest of society, and we do that by highly technical internships that help develop new AI-enabled products and services or help existing products and services be AI-enabled. We've run over 90 projects since we started, 41 in the last fiscal. Over half of the interns that have done our projects are actually deploying AI in industry or government, and almost a quarter get hired directly by our project partners. So we can act as a real force multiplier, not just helping develop new products and services, but embedding that talent into the organization to continue that work over the long term. Got a high success rate, and we've done many events like this. And like our Ocean of Data Challenge, so if there's any students in the room, we've got an Ocean of Data Challenge being launched next week with SailGP, so some real cool data to continue the sailing analogy or focus, but it's a great opportunity if you want to get your hands dirty with some really cool data. So a lot of the AI that's run our society and that we've been introduced to in the past is really narrow types of AI, and this is a very general umbrella. But the machine learning-based recommender engines that run your social media feed, run your sort of shopping recommendations, these technologies have been around us for a long time now. They're generally very stable, have very specific applications, and are still a very powerful force that we can leverage. So I want to make sure that we're not forgetting about all these other types of AI, and even things like evolutionary AI can give us real explainability in processes that maybe generative AI can't. So lots of opportunities there. But as far as generative AI goes, it's been quite the evolution because they really started as complex probability machines. You put in a prompt, and it gives you a statistical representation of what it thinks you're asking from them. So relatively dumb or sort of basic responses. But what's happened really in the past 6 months around the holidays, we reached an inflection point where they became complex reasoning machines. You can see that exemplified by their ability to do math. If you use these machines a lot or these systems a lot, a year ago, you'd try to do math or sort of assess mathematics with it, and they were horrible. And really, they hit that inflection point around the holidays where now they can do pretty incredible things. And it's allowed the evolution of agentic systems, really the deployment of this technology at scale in a way that we can implement it and start to rely on it. We're certainly not there. This is not a fully hardened, realized to its true extent. But as you've learned, there's pretty amazing ways that it's adding significant value today. So, they were able to first describe or understand, then apply complex reasoning, which is what we see now, and now act outside of themselves to do things in society and actually self-improve in the process. So these systems are doubling in capability every 6 to 8 months right now. It's on an exponential curve, and as we're all aware, it's a pretty wild ride. So what are some of the ethical and sort of risk profiles that these technologies bring, and specifically generative AI? And as many people have talked about, explainability is really the biggest risk factor, where we get these great outputs, these decisions, but going back and tracing exactly how they got to this conclusion is still really hard with these systems. Hallucinations are actually reduced significantly, and if you've been using these tools for a long time, you see it. And that's actually a big risk factor. We all grew up using calculators. We've all been trained to go 2 + 2 = 4, and if we ask a computer, even a very basic computer like a calculator, we have been trained to trust it. And now that these hallucinations are reduced significantly, we're increasingly trusting and reducing the critical thinking that we apply to them. Knowledge and accountability are moving from people to machines. That's a huge risk factor. There's so many movies about AI in the future. And WALL-E is one of my favorite ones, not because of the environmental side of it, because that's terrifying, but the way that AI services the people in that and distracts them from their lives and just entertains them and keeps them fat and happy. And, so that is the extreme of knowledge and accountability moving from people to these systems. And AI slop, the outputs of these systems, degrades the social contract. In the news today, it was really, or not today, but over the past week, it was really cool to see that with some tornado warning systems, they have a serious issue now where people are generating pictures of tornadoes and posting them on social media. And we're getting to that boy who cried wolf scenario where the more of this data, the more of these images that get put out there that aren't truthful, they degrade our trust in society and they degrade our trust in authorities. And arguably, that's one of the most critical issues that we have in our society right now is a degradation of the social contract. We saw that through COVID. And now one of the big concerns is how much will AI, enabled by social media, sort of platforms that are not beheld to what is posted on them, and what impact will that have on our society? And we're starting to see the edges kind of degrade a bit more and blur. And I think that for public policy perspectives, that's one of the big things that we need to focus on. You can see that with things like deep fakes, all kinds of outputs from AI, and really sort of understanding their impact. So how can we mitigate these? A number of people have talked about humans in the loop. That's very important. So at key decision points or inflection points of using these tools, having somebody see or sort of assess what the output is. Named accountability is really important. So being able to say in your organization, this individual is responsible for the outputs. Prime example of that would be the head of customer success, the person who is responsible for the way your organization interacts with the public and with your customers, and making sure that that person is explicitly, or the people in that team are explicitly responsible for how AI engages with those and how that impacts your social capital as an organization. And one thing that's becoming more and more apparent is critical thought and subject matter expertise is now more important than it has ever been. These technologies are a force multiplier. I've said that before, but they really do accentuate and amplify what your organization does and how it does it. And it's that exercise of if you engage with these systems and you ask about something that you have deep expertise in, you can poke holes in it and it's missing this context or this bit of data. But then when you query a system about something you don't know much about, you're like, wow, this is brilliant. It's great. And really sort of applying that perspective and keeping that in mind, that experience is really important. And it's both on the front end of how you prompt and look to get your answers out of these systems and the answers they give you. So bias. These systems inherently, they're trained on our collective data. And they reflect our biases. And most of our biases aren't overt. And we've all heard probably stories about the early days of generative AI where, an image labeling system at Google labels, especially women of African heritage, as gorillas, how I think it was an AWS or Amazon system that when it was looking through resumes, one of the categories that we found out it was assessing was people's postal codes or zip codes. So that has huge socioeconomic implications. a lot of those very explicit biases that we saw in the early days of these technologies have been shaped out of them. And now it more represents our own biases in society, which are often very subtle. They're in the context of the way questions are asked, or who's confronted about something or asked about something. And as these things evolve, those biases are getting more and more subtle, which is good because they're less prominent and less sort of explicit. But we've got to be very careful that we're not less diligent about them and understanding them and holding the companies that produce these technologies accountable for those outcomes. As the systems get wider, yes, the bias is going from overt to covert, and we expect computer systems to be neutral, again, going back to the calculator, and we trust confident voices. So again, that critical thought, just constantly going back to that critical thought. And the instructions that we give these systems, the languages that we use, the people that we exclude when building frameworks, prompts, things like that. So we own a lot of the bias because we're the ones giving instructions, we're the ones setting the context, shaping the outcomes of these systems. We need to be really diligent about our own actions and the way that we're influencing and looking to get responses from them. And we need to make sure that those are representative of all people in society and not just sort of a tight group of usually mostly male people developing the systems. And generative AI threatens our jobs and relationships, sometimes in a very real way. Arguably, we're kind of creating gods or sort of a version of, so from a religious standpoint, that can be very threatening. Oftentimes, we see our family members or people who are close to us start asking very personal questions to these systems that you used to ask your partner before, and now you're asking ChatGPT. And that impacts us on a very personal level, and we develop our own biases towards the technologies as a whole. And in any organization that you're involved in, change management is at the foundation of what we're talking about today. And understanding that the people that you're interacting with, many of you in this room, many of us, we all have these biases towards these technologies because they're so close to us. They're based on our physical self, trained on our data, and it's very real. So how do you mitigate that? Well, testing outcomes and decision logging. So, testing the outcomes and logging those outcomes and being able to track them and test them over time. And again, that's the kind of thing that you can set up an agentic system or a generative AI-based system to help do that. So the tools themselves, the technologies themselves, if used in a very explicit way or sort of, you can use them to help mitigate some of these issues. Being very careful about your inputs and prompts. If you use a huge amount of data, and the context windows are getting massive now, so if you use a huge amount of data as part of your prompt or context, being very careful about the data that you're using because the systems are designed to be very positive and engaging, and they'll just use that data and present it in a way that's totally normalized. So what we put into these systems and how we prompt them is incredibly important. Trusted vendors. Using vendors that are explicitly beheld to the outputs of these systems is really important. I don't want to say I'm not saying don't trust startups, but I'm saying ask the real questions if you're using generative AI-enabled technologies because more and more, the models at the base, the intelligence is going to be buried deeper and deeper under software layers that are designed to get the right answers. And understanding before you get into the use of an AI-enabled system, who are those foundation models? How have they been trained? Who's responsible ultimately for the output? And then setting AI boundaries. I refuse to have AI write my emails because that erodes my social capital. And I make sure that on emotional levels or issues that are emotionally relevant, I don't ask AI, I ask my partner, because that's our relationship. And I don't want to degrade that by putting AI between it. So setting boundaries as an individual and organization will help you understand and sort of use these technologies in a way that doesn't harm yourself in the long run or other people. Data. So LLM outputs have limited IP protections. It's interesting. My mom's a fine artist. We've looked at converting some of her digital art, her analog slides to digital. If we use generative AI to do that, it erodes the IP of it. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to sort of say I'm a lawyer, but certainly around some of these issues, it's really important to know what you're doing. Data omission in training and prompts, talked about that a minute ago. Data exposure to LLMs. You know, if you have a free or even a low-tier subscription to an LLM and you put data in, you want to make sure that your privacy settings are set up, that you read the terms and services, because your data can find its way in there and be used and exposed. So agentic data leaks, you know, these are reasoning machines, and having the proper frameworks around them to ensure that they don't leak your own data in the process. And data storage and discovery risk, I think, is really important. In every organization we've been involved in, or I've ever been involved in, you're probably involved in, there's massive filing systems with data everywhere. And agentic systems are amazing at combing through it all and pulling out the data that can really hurt your organization. We just saw with Nova Scotia Power here in Nova Scotia, huge data leak. It had a bunch of SIN numbers from like the 90s or something, and that was exposed by hackers. Now we have agentic systems who can comb through all your files and find all the skeletons in the closet. And it's quite scary. And then there's the data sovereignty issue, which has been talked about. So again, humans in the loop, named accountability, purging risky, low-utility data in your organization is a way to mitigate risk. From an organizational impact standpoint, it's moving from tasks to making judgments. So the tasks are no longer done by people, the judgments are no longer being made by people. We're seeing a bit of agentic specification and control failure and drift, and there's some debate on whether or not drift will ever end with LLMs. So the layers and structures that we put around these systems are more and more important. There's a high incentive for people to use tools outside. If someone can replace 10 hours a week and drop it down to 2 hours a week in your organization because of a tool, that's a high incentive for people to use it. And a lot of pressure to adopt before understanding. You've got to figure, are you creating capacity or dependency? If you build or get too involved in a foundation model right now, your token costs are going to go through the roof real soon here. So understanding in your organization, are you creating dependency along with creating capacity? There's also a loss of institutional memory with some of these things. That's a huge part of what makes an organization special is the people, the institutional memory, the tacit knowledge. So really understanding what are you losing when you implement a system and replace people in different functions. And AI substitution in relationships erodes social capital. So how do you mitigate it? Process re-engineering with humans in the loop. You know, that process engineering is really probably the biggest lever that people have to both implement AI and mitigate risks. Strong vendors and clear policies around use, boundaries, ability to sandbox new tools and test new tools in a continual way, and having quality alternatives for your people to use. If you don't have alternatives, the incentive for them to use sort of unapproved tools is high, really high. And human-owed outcomes. So lastly, got 1 minute left. So critical thinking and expertise, again, are now more important than they've ever been. And we're certainly seeing that in computer science, where a great computer engineer can do incredible things with these tools. Someone with a deep expertise in an area, like mathematics or something else, can just do fantastic things with them. And really applying that critical thinking and expertise is super important. In the absence of regulation, because that's what we're used to using for our guardrails in society, but it's moving too quick. So in the absence of regulation, responsibility for managing AI risks falls to the individual and the organization. Ethics is now a design problem, not a compliance problem. Process re-engineering, again, is the lever that most people have to manage these risks. Ethical AI is a continual practice, not a one-time thing. And fear-driven adoption increases the risk profile because you're not acting rationally. Agentic systems can actually increase risk profiles. Incredibly powerful tool. I'm not saying they're bad. You just need to be very careful about their deployment. And lastly, which I think is really cool, we have laws and regulations covering most AI ethical issues. We just need to adjust them and update them to cover. And if you think of something like deepfakes, we don't allow people to steal each other's identity. It's identity theft. If we update those laws to say, I don't know if we need to go quite as far as I think it was Denmark that copyright gave everybody individual copyright over their own image. I don't know if we need to go that far, but it's an interesting way. But certainly we should change our laws so that your own image and somebody using that with AI to create something that isn't you is the same thing as identity theft. So thank you. Please, if you want to work on projects, you need great AI talent, reach out. And thank you for your time today.